In this video, we're going to talk about the concepts of consumer and producer surplus, and these represent the net benefits that buyers and sellers receive from trade. The very simple premise of all of this is that people only buy things if they believe it will make them better off, and people will only sell things if they think it will make them better off. So we're going to be able to attempt to capture or measure the gains that buyers and sellers receive by engaging in trade. It's helpful if we think about demand in a somewhat different way. Up to this point, we've thought about the demand curve as telling us the quantity of a good demanded at each price. But we can, in an equivalent way, think of it as the price that someone's willing to pay for each unit of quantity. For example, let's suppose we have a good that people place very different values on in a small community. One person values this good at $9.50. A second person values it at $8. The third person values it at $6, the fourth at $5, the fifth at $4, and the sixth at $2, and finally the seventh person values it at $1. The demand curve here that we sketched out is a bit jaggy. We call this a stepwise function, but it essentially tells us how many people will buy this good at any given price. What we can note is that in this example, the first person will buy it because they value the good at $9.50, but they only have to pay $4.50. The second unit is valued at $8, but again, people only have to pay $4.50 to buy it, so that will be purchased. The third unit is valued at $6, which is still more than the $4.50 that they have to pay. The fourth person values this good at $5, and they still would benefit by buying it at a price of $4.50. However, the fifth person only values the good at $4, and since it costs $4.50, they're not going to buy it. We're going to look at how we can measure the value of the benefit that these consumers receive in total. The price that someone's willing to pay for the first unit, which in this case is $9.50, is a measure of the marginal benefit received from that first unit, the additional benefit that someone receives. The second unit of a good provides $8 of benefit to someone, which is the marginal benefit of the second unit. The third provides 6 units of additional benefit, and the fourth provides 5. If we want to measure the total benefit, all we have to do is add up the marginal benefits received from each one of these units. So we would have $9.50 plus 8 plus 6 plus 5. And that would be a dollar value of the total benefits received by these consumers in this market. To measure the cost, we know the total amount that consumers pay is equal to the price of the good times the number purchased, which in this case would be that red shaded area here, which is just $4.50 times 4. Consumer surplus is defined to be the net benefit, and the net benefit is just equal to total benefit minus total cost, which we can represent here. This gold shaded region represents the consumer surplus, or the gains that consumers receive by engaging in this transaction. Again, to see that, the first person who buys this good was willing to pay $9.50. That's how much it's worth to them. That's the maximum price they'd pay. They only had to pay $4.50. So they receive consumer surplus of $5, the difference between $9.50 and $4.50. The second person values it at $8. They had to pay $4.50. So they would receive $3.50 worth of consumer surplus. And if we add up those little rectangles, we get the total value of consumer surplus. So consumer surplus represents the net benefit or the net gain that consumers receive by participating in trade. We can also define something similar in terms of suppliers. Up to this point, we've been talking about supply as a quantity supplied at each price, but we can also think of it as the minimum price that a seller would have to receive to be willing to supply a unit. As was discussed in an earlier video, we expect that opportunity costs will go up as more of a good is produced. Someone is willing to sell this good for $1. Another person is willing to sell another unit only if the price is $3. A third person will only sell it if the price is $4, and so on as we move up this curve. So the supply curve represents the minimum price that someone is willing to pay in order to sell this good. Just as we define consumer surplus as the net benefits that consumers receive, we can define producer surplus as the net gains that sellers receive from selling a good. That's equal to this gray shaded area here. The first seller was willing to sell it for $1. They end up receiving $4.50, so they gain $3.50 worth of surplus. The next unit of the good is valued at $3, but it's sold for $1.50, so there's another $1.50 worth of surplus there. And finally, the third seller values the good at $4. They sell it for $4.50. They still gain 50 cents worth of net benefit. So that entire gray shaded area represents the producer's surplus, the net benefit that the sellers receive by selling this good. More generally, we're going to have markets with often millions of buyers and generally thousands or tens of thousands of producers. And we'd still have, in a sense, all those little rectangles there. But because the quantities are so large, the curve smooths out. When we look at the entire market, we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. If we imagine very small increments of 1 unit in width, those shaded areas essentially still represent the marginal benefits that producers receive and the marginal opportunity cost of the sellers in terms of how much they value or how much it costs them to produce each additional unit. And when we do that, consumer surplus, the area between the demand curve and the price, is measured by that gold shaded area in this diagram. And producer surplus represents the difference between the price that producers receive and the minimum price that they would have been willing to receive. The dollar value of the net benefit, so the gains from trade that producers receive, is given by that light blue triangle in the bottom of this curve. If we want to measure surplus, let's take this demand curve and this supply curve. Consumer surplus is the triangle that exists between the price that consumers pay and the demand curve. And remember, the area of a triangle is given by 1/2 the base times the height. So the base of that triangle is 80, the height is 40, so the area of consumer surplus here would equal 1/2 times 80 times 40, or 1,600. Similarly, producer surplus can just be measured again in the same way as the area between the price and the supply curve, which is given by 1/2 times the base times the height, which is 1/2 times 80 times 30, or 1,200. The total gains from trade, or the total surplus in this market, is just the sum of consumer and producer surplus, which in this case is equal to 1,600 plus 1,200, or 2,800.